How are you guys this morning? Are you well rested? I'm pretty thankful that I've got the first session because I think I'm going to hopefully stretch your minds a little bit. So maybe just to give you a little bit more background about me, my background is in the natural sciences. So I studied meteorology. So maybe for who of you am I the first meteorologist that you've actually come across in the real world? Okay, cool. Yeah, I always think that's kind of the most interesting thing about me. And it may seem strange because I'm very kind of far away from where I started. Maybe just another question. Who of you are actually working in the kind of profession that you studied? Not very many, hey? It's like, I think I read somewhere it's like 10 or 20% of people actually practice what they studied. So, but I find myself very often more kind of in the space of industrial psychologists. So the meteorologist and the psychologist, it sounds almost a bit like a joke. But I think if you think about it, you know, human systems and weather systems are not that different. So for those of you who work with people, do you find them to be predictable at all? Do you find human systems to be predictable? No, not too much. And every now and again, there's a bit of a storm as well. So I think you can see the link. So now I've just told you that I come from the sciences, and I'm going to start with a poem. So hopefully that kind of sets the tone for today. So this is one of my favorite poems by Antonio Machado. And I'm going to give you some time to read that. And I think the part that really speaks to me is, traveler, there is no path. The path is made by walking. And what I really enjoyed in yesterday's closing keynote was this idea that we need to become comfortable and befriend uncertainty. And this, you know, I find that we kind of believe that there is a path, that we're not in uncharted territory, and sometimes that's true. But I think none of us have actually been in a world that is quite as volatile and uncertain as the one that we're in today. And so for many of us, especially when you're dealing with complex things like creating adaptive cultures or agile transformations, we are very much in that space where we are making the path as we're walking. And so that is where I want to spend some time today, is how do we function in this world? How do we befriend uncertainty? And how do we enable these adaptive cultures? And I think something that was a bit of a thread yesterday was around the people aspect of things. You know, how do we care for our people? How do we enable people? How do we keep them from not burning out? You know, I loved that whole thread. And I think today what I would like to spend time on is the environment that we put those people in. But we'll get to that. Okay, so first off, we're going to talk about designing for emergence, and how do we befriend uncertainty and ambiguity. So a lot of what I do, a little bit more about me, I'm the South African partner for Professor Dave Snowden, who developed the Cynefin framework. Who of you have heard of him and Cynefin? Quite a few. So I'm unashamedly going to throw some science at you. Is that okay? That's why I said I'm glad it's the morning session, because if I had the afternoon session, it would have been difficult. But also I'm going to give you some metaphors, just to kind of scaffold your understanding a bit. And I know that there's several of you who've heard me speak in the past, so I try to come up with new metaphors so that you don't get bored with all the old ones. Okay, so maybe just first off, I love these two pictures because I think we've kind of come to think of our world as being a little bit like this. You know, and you see it in how we categorize people in our organizations. You know, how many of you have heard about the challenge, for example, that millennials present in the workplace? How many of you have you heard that? Yeah. And there are always these stereotypes of what we expect millennials to be like, and then they don't fit our categories. Does that ring a bell as well? We do the same with our clients. We put them in categories. You know, how many of you have got customer segments in your organization? For those of you that, yeah. And I don't know about, you know, if you've noticed this, but the customers don't really act in the way that our segments assume that they act. They don't really think too much about our categories when they interact with our organizations. So we have this idea that our world and our organization is nicely structured like this, but actually it's quite messy. And if you think about it, this picture here makes no sense. That little boy is not interacting at all with his toys because having these structured and rigid categories is not really coherent for us as human beings. So that is a word that I'm going to start using more and more. It's this idea of coherence. That, although it's messy, is coherent. It makes sense. Because we expect a child to be playing in a sandpit and for there to be mess. So this idea of context is a really important one. We really need to understand that there are different contexts that we're dealing with. And especially when it comes to agility, I think we've also, in many organizations, I think agility has been sold a little bit like a silver bullet. Like everything should now be agile. And I don't believe that is true. I think there are contexts where agility is appropriate and there are contexts where it's not. And so we're going to be spending quite a bit of time just looking at context today as well. So how do I see agility? I actually think agility is an emergent property. I think it emerges in organizations. And I think there are three things that they all three need to be present. So I chose the primary colors on purpose. So agility is in the middle and it's the white color. How many of you remember your, I don't even know what science it is, probably physics, hey? That the three primary colors through a prism make white light. So we need skills and practices, we need enabling structures, and then we need a stance or a mindset. Now, I know Dave Snowden will probably, turn in his grave when I use the word mindset, but I haven't come across a better one yet. But it's this idea of, it's a way of thinking and it's a paradigm. And very often what we find, well, maybe just from the audience, in a typical agile process or transformation, where do you feel the focus is? If you think of those three things. Skills and practices. And I think for those of you who've been involved in Agile for a long time, I think we've all come to realize that it's much more of a culture change process than it's about skills and practices. And then what we very often neglect are the enabling structures. So we may look at that on a team level, but then on an organizational level, we very often neglect those. So I want to play a video for you guys that just frames some of what happens when we focus almost exclusively on skills and practices. Some of you may have seen this before, so just enjoy it for a second time.
To answer that question, we set up a hidden camera experiment to see if this one will stand up at the sound of this tone, simply because everyone else is. You might be thinking, never go along with this. Or would you? After just 3 weeks, and without knowing why she's doing it, this woman is now conforming perfectly to the group. But what happens if we take the group away?
Elaine, please.
Okay, now she's alone. The crowd is gone, and nobody is watching her except our hidden cameras. What do you think she'll do? She's now conforming to the rules of the group without them even being there. Now, watch what happens when we introduce another outsider who doesn't know the rules.
Have a seat and I'll be back in just a couple of minutes. Anytime.
I'm going to pause it there. What do you think he's going to do? He's going to do what? He's going to look at her that she's crazy. And then? 50-50 chance. Okay, maybe let's say, who thinks he's not going to stand up? Raise your hands. Who thinks he's going to stand up? Well, so it's almost 50-50. Okay, you're ready to see what he does. So there's the look. You predicted the look. I don't actually know what's worse. The woman who started standing up when everybody else was doing it, or the guy who thought everybody was doing it, so I thought I was supposed to, is a good enough answer to also start doing it. I don't know. But we think this is funny, but how much of this is happening in our organizations? Every day. And if we focus on teaching people only skills and practices, and we don't actually teach them why things work a certain way, like what is agility really? It's then we kind of have people, attending stand-ups and going to retrospectives because they were told to do it, but they don't really know why. Does this ring a bell for any of you? I love this video. It's just, what I really enjoy is watching her, because in the beginning, did you notice she was quite tentative? She didn't really, and in the end, she was like the expert at standing up for no reason. Did you notice how her demeanor changed? So normally when I do this talk, I focus on those three things. So the skills, the stance, and the structures, and I use three metaphors to unpack it. Today I'm going to focus more on just one of those metaphors. So normally what I do is for the stance, we need to think like chefs and not like recipe book users. And I think recipes, running the risk of offending people in the room, I think recipes are a bit of a crutch for the agile industry. We love recipes and frameworks. And this idea of thinking like a chef and creating our own, I think is really important. And then secondly, when it comes to the skills, I use the metaphor of a jazz band and how they collectively improvise and the meta skills that's needed for that. So how do we collectively co-create in the moment? But I'm not going to be going into those today. There's several people in the room who've heard those talks multiple times, so I thought I'd spare you. The third one is actually my favorite, and that is to illustrate what's needed for enabling structures. So I'm a blogger. How many of you also blog? Not too many. You should start. It's quite fun. And I think the kind of holy grail for a blogger is if something goes viral. That's kind of but what I've learned is that you can't make something go viral. It kind of just happens. And this post very, very nearly did. And it was picked up by a cartoonist I think it's in Norway, but it's in one of the Scandinavian countries. And she drew this for me and sent me the cartoon. So when you're thinking about enabling structures in your organization, and basically how your organization is structured, and you keep the video that I just played in mind, then I think this will speak for itself. So I don't, I actually speak a lot more frequently in front of business audiences, not necessarily agile audiences or even technical audiences, and this particular metaphor resonates, particularly with the OD community and with executives. I'm not entirely sure what it is about it, but it feels like it's just it's like pressing a hot button in organizations. So if you think about your own organizations, do they more resemble zoos, or do they more resemble jungles? Or ecosystems? We love throwing the word ecosystem around, so let's say, do they more resemble zoos, or do they more resemble natural ecosystems? Zoos, raise your hand. Be honest. Yeah, a little bit. Very often what we find, is if we do focus in our organizations on the practices and on structures on a local level, we create these little jungle-like pockets within a bigger zoo. Does that resonate a bit more? And I think the problem is, if we think of agility and what the real essence is of agility and all the things that we want from a people perspective. So, we've been talking about some of these. We want engaged people. We want people that enjoy coming to work and that bring their creativity to work. We want people to be in the flow. We want people to collaborate. We want all of these things. So now the question is, how engaged will I be in a zoo? I'm kind of get fed every day. I'm here for the paycheck. Why must I be engaged? Who will I collaborate with? We're all in separate cages. It's not too much. I might be a little bit engaged playing politics in my own little cage, but, it's... other than that, there's not too much of that happening in a zoo. Also, if I'm in the jungle and I'm on my own, I'm dinner. If I'm in the zoo and I'm on my own, I'm the star, for those of you who watched Madagascar. So the structures that we create basically undermines everything that we want for our people. And if you think, to just mix metaphors for a moment, I can send my people on courses to teach them how to improvise and how to co-create new music in the moment. If I put them in a symphony orchestra environment, how welcome will that improvisation be? If I'm the guy that plays the little triangle, and I decide, this is boring, I'm going to just start improvising a bit. What will happen to me in the symphony orchestra? It's not going to be very welcome, hey? And I think we set people up for failure. We teach them all of these skills, for how to be agile and how to be adaptive, and then we put them into environments that don't support that. So I know that Toyota is quite a star company in this community, so I thought I needed a Toyota quote, so I got one. So this is Nigel Thurlow. He's the Chief of Agile. That sounds like a pretty cool title to me, at Toyota Connect. And what I really love about what he's saying there is we need to optimize the system for the flow of value, even if that means changing the entire system. And then we must stop doing agile and start enabling flow and shortening feedback loops. Then we will become agile. And I think very often we kind of make agile the point. And in this, agile is not, it's a result or an outcome, and it's an outcome towards something. We want to enable the flow of value through our organizations. In the end, it's all about the customer. This is the other problem, is if you're in a symphony orchestra, you're not really getting much feedback from the audience, are you? Even if, if I'm in the audience and I want to give some feedback in the middle of a movement, and I start, I stand up and I start clapping, what will happen to me? I'll be removed. Whereas in a jazz band, you can influence the music. So this idea of enabling flow and shortening feedback loops, and agile actually being something that just, it's an outcome, it emerges, it's not the thing that we're supposed to focus on, I think is a key aspect. And I want to go to the natural world for a couple of metaphors. So what do these three things have in common, do you think? If you look at those almost as systems, say again? They're unique, yeah. There's bifurcation, yeah. So the design is slightly similar. What else? Different scales. Yes, they're all flow systems. So over there we've got, a tree. So, it pulls the water out of the earth and then it releases, oxygen and all kinds of things back into the atmosphere. Interesting thing is snowflakes, the reason why they make these patterns is that's the most effective way to release heat. And then over here we've got river systems. This is in Tibet, that's why, so the snow cover makes the image quite interesting. So these are all flow systems. And there's a guy called Anthony Bejan. I'm not sure if I'm saying his name correctly, he's a professor. He basically created or discovered, let's rather say, a new law in physics. And what that states, it's the constructal law. It's a bit of a rabbit hole if you want to go and do some reading. But what that states is that given freedom, flow systems will generate better and better configurations to flow more easily. Basically, what he says is that design or form follows flow. And I think very often what we do is we put the design and the form down first, and then we expect things to flow through it. And the key thing here for me is that thing of given freedom. So basically what he discovered, the reason why all of these systems basically look more or less the same. So if you look at the tree, if you look at the rivers, even if you look inside your own body, like our veins, our blood system, blood flow system, our brains, our lungs, all of these things that facilitate flow also look like that, because that is the most effective design for something to flow. And over time, in the natural world, the system will evolve to optimize flow when given freedom. And I think that the really interesting thing for me is our human systems are also flow systems. I think we know this. Even a manufacturing system, something comes in on the one side and customer value needs to flow through the other side. Otherwise, why does this system exist? But do we give it the freedom to evolve? And then this is the same guy, basically what he said is, life is movement. To be alive is to keep on flowing and morphing. When a system stops flowing and morphing, it is dead. And so this is a really interesting idea for me to think about, and I want to dive a little bit deeper into flow and link it to context. So I'm going to introduce you to the Cynefin framework. I'm going to try and do it in a very non-theoretical way. I hope that works. I know it's early in the morning. So how many of you know Cynefin? How many of you have used it? Okay. You've heard it more than a couple of times, though, BS. It's like. So making sense with Cynefin. So basically, what Cynefin is a sense-making framework. It's got the curvy lines by design, so it's not a 2x2 matrix. And it's got 7 domains, although at the moment I'm just going to speak or talk through 4 of them. It basically divides the world into 3 different kinds of systems. Ordered systems, which is a little bit like the sandpit picture in the beginning, where everything is nicely ordered and neat. Chaotic systems, where everything is basically unconstrained and random. It's the domain of surprise and crisis. And then the domain of complexity, which is where we'll spend most of our time. So it's a typology. I think we're going to use it a little bit into, categorizing things today, but that is not really what it's supposed to be used for, or the best way to use it. It's a dynamic framework, but just to explain it, I will talk you through each of these domains separately. So in the obvious domain, this is a domain of obvious order. Things are routine, they're completely known, it's known knowns, we can categorize them and respond. So an example of this would be, what side of the road do we drive on in South Africa? Left. Okay. It's interesting how many people need to think about it first before they answer. But it's quite obvious. And then also what will happen if you don't is also quite obvious. So this is the legitimate domain of best practice. This is where we can use recipes and best practices. Nothing here is changing anymore. It can be automated, basically, things that sit in the obvious domain. Then in the complicated domain, so the example that I put there, I don't know how many of you share this, is parallel parking. Because when I was taught how to drive in a driving school, I was taught a recipe. I don't know how many of you, there were poles, and then they said, when the 3rd pole is in that mirror, turn all the way, and then in the real world, there were no poles. So now I still struggle with parallel parking. So another example would be, I'm driving along the road, my car stops, multiple lights come on. It's not obvious what the problem is. Somewhere there's an expert that can hopefully come and do some analysis and tell me. And there may be more than one right answer. Okay, so that is the domain of complicated, known unknowns. We analyze, we apply expertise, and this is the domain of good practice. Okay, makes sense so far? Key thing on this side of the framework is that the context isn't changing, outcomes are known. This is where we can apply. If you've got an MBA, for example, you're very well equipped to function in that world. Then we've got the domain of chaos. Here we act first. So I think some Ford Cougar owners might have. So for those of you who are not from South Africa, we had some issues with Ford Cougars just catching fire for no reason. There's no time to try and analyze what kind of fire it is or to apply any best practice. You just need to get out of the car. So that is the domain of chaotic. We're dealing with unknowable unknowns. This is where it's strategic surprise. And here we've got novel practice. This is also the domain of innovation. When you've got a crisis, then all of a sudden, all of those holy cow processes that you can never question, suddenly the organization becomes a little bit more open for those to be questioned when there's a crisis. So send in an innovation team when you deploy your crisis teams. That's a good heuristic. And then we've got the domain of complexity. Here we do safe-to-fail experiments, and we learn. So in the original, Cynefin terms, we'd say we probe, we sense, we respond. So yesterday afternoon, we ended off with the previous speaker, John, also spoke about small and safe-to-fail experiments. That is what we do in complex, because it's unknown unknowns. We don't know what we don't know, and we need to be exploring. So on this side of the framework, sorry, it's cutting off a little bit, we exploit. On that side of the framework, we explore. So in complexity, we explore, and in complicated and obvious, we exploit. And so there's a continuous dynamic between exploration and exploitation if you understand how to basically apply this framework to your organization. So that's the basics of Cynefin. There's the disorder domain in the middle that I'm not going to go into, and then there are also liminal domains, which is interesting, which is the domains, for example, between complex and complicated. And Dave recently made it a domain in itself, because things can actually spend quite a bit of time there. It's interesting, that is where we believe something like Scrum sits, to start transitioning something from that domain where, in complexity, typically we've got more assumptions than we've got known facts. As we start learning, some things actually, through our experimentation, we start learning more and more, and so the assumptions become fewer, and something starts transitioning across that boundary into complicated. And that is where we start doing the iterations. So does this make sense to you guys so far? Because I want to apply this now to this idea of flow. Now this is brand new. It's untested. It's an hypothesis from my side, so you guys can tell me if you agree or not. But when I looked at this idea of flow and different things flowing in different contexts, this is what I came up with. So in the obvious domain, from how people work together, we've got cooperation. This is typically, it's like a production line. It's almost like if you read the original Takuchi Nonaka article that inspired Scrum. It's this idea almost of a relay race. And we're looking at the effective or the efficient flow of work and resources. Okay, so if you think production line again, that is what I believe the focus is in obvious. And this is not exclusive. This is the thing with Cynefin being a typology. You'll find these in the different domains, but I think this is the primary thing that we focus on in obvious. Then in complicated, over and above efficient flow of resources, we also need to look at effective flow of knowledge and information, because there we need to collaborate. Okay? And it's the domain of the expert, if you remember. So here we need to, things aren't obvious anymore. We actually now need to start working together towards typically a known and a shared outcome or goal. Then in complex, that is where we need to start focusing on co-creation, co-evolution, and adaptability. So in the previous slide, the picture that I had there for complex was cars on the road. So for those of you who are South African and who use the South African roads, how many of you have noticed that you've become a bit more or less law-abiding over the last 2-3 years on the roads? Just confession time. It's not only me, is it? It's like, yeah. Because there are these moments, it seems as if our traffic laws have become suggestions. So very often there's this moment, like particularly I would be standing at an intersection and cars would be just ignoring the traffic lights. And then there's this moment where I need to choose. Am I going to be part of the problem and just do what everybody else is doing and actually get across this intersection and be on time for a meeting? Or am I just going to be law-abiding and sit here for an hour because people just clog the intersection? Does this ring a bell for any of you? The problem is that we're creating a culture where it's okay to break laws. We call that process co-evolution. So I am influencing the system, and the system is influencing me. Both of us are evolving, and you can't go back to how things used to be. It's irreversible. So in the end, you kind of just need to work with what you've got. And that is the nature of the complex domain. And so in complexity, we've got these aspects of co-evolution and co-creation. So this is the jazz band, creating music in the moment. We need fluidity, not only flow. And if you think about what that means, it's co-creating meaning, content, and context in the flow. So how do we create fluid enterprises? So if you think back to that the physics law that said that flow systems will naturally evolve to maximize flow, how do we create organizations that in the moment can change how they're structured, how their processes work, the systems? So not only content, but also their contexts and their structures. And for me, this idea of fluidity speaks to that. So it's not only about flow and maximizing workflow, maximizing the flow of information. It's about creating fluid enterprises. And then in chaos, I couldn't really figure out what flows there. If anybody has any ideas, you can come and tell me. But this is where we need resilience, because this is where we get strategic surprise. This is where things catch us completely off guard. So it's crisis response, it's resilience. And actually, in both of these domains, complex and chaos, sometimes when I speak to OD and HR audiences, I get myself in trouble because I don't, how many of you talk about we need more change management? Maybe in these domains we do. Over there, I think change management's an oxymoron. I don't think that you can manage change in a context that's continuously in flux. We need change resilience. People need to become change fit. So how do we create organizations that are change fit is an interesting question. You'll see that I ask more questions than I give you answers. My favorite answer in complexity is it depends when somebody asks me. Because everything is context specific, everything is contingent. So if this is what we're dealing with, how do we then move forwards? So in terms of creating flow and moving forwards, I think we really understand how to do that in the two ordered domains. So remember I said that the context isn't changing, so we know where we are, we know where we're going, what the goal is, and typically we know how to get there. So in obvious, we can just, we've done it before. It's basically just categorizing and giving it to somebody to go and do. And we can set fixed timelines, we can have fixed scope, all of these things. We know how to function there. Up in complicated, again, we know where we are, we know where we want to get to, but we may not know now exactly how to get there. So we employ experts, we may iterate, we may follow a bit of a twisty path, but still we know more or less how to get there. The question is, what do we do in complex? Where the context is continuously shifting, so we don't necessarily even know where A is. We don't even know where we are necessarily at any given moment because everything around us is in flux. So I want to introduce you to a framework. This is still emerging. So this is me applying most of what I've learned from the different complexity thinkers into what is hopefully quite a practical framework. I'm calling it the Ways Finder for now. I've kind of cycled through various different names, and this one seems to stick, but I'm not entirely happy with it. It's Ways Finder, not Wayfinder, because in complexity there's always more than one way. Okay? And it is around enabling fluidity. So, first off, A is not in a single place. So if you think of a typical organization, how many of you have gone through culture processes that's like, we shall be one? There is the, I can't think of well, Toyota has it, so I'll just use that. There's the Toyota way. And we all have a way. How many of you have gone through that? And now the values go up on the walls, and all the values have associated behaviors. Does this ring a bell? And we must all be the same. How many of you have ever seen that work? Have you ever seen a company where they're all the same? Can we expect a call center and a marketing department and an IT department to be exactly the same? We can expect them to kind of have the same values, to be coherent in terms of who the organization is, but we can't expect them to express it in exactly the same way. The contexts are completely different. So the first thing is, where are we? And then the second is that B is no longer a specific outcome, it is a direction. So we move in a certain direction. So first off, we need to orient ourselves. So some of you might know the OODA loop as well. I don't know how many of you have come across this, but it's this idea of we need to orient ourselves in the landscape. Where are we now in this fluid landscape? And it's basically just a point in time because the landscape is shifting. Then we need directionality. We need a sense of direction. Added to that, we need boundaries. And there are two different kinds. So the one down here, Dave Snowden calls those governing constraints. But it's this idea that there are some constraints in a system that we can't do anything about. We need to work within them. For those of you in the banking industry, you would be very familiar with these. There are certain things that we just need to comply to. So these are laws, regulations, it could even be budgets. You know, so if you think about we're all heading off into uncharted territory, you know, it's like there are reefs here. We can wish them away, but they are there. We just need to deal with them. So there are those kinds of boundaries, and then there are what I'm calling containment boundaries. Dave Snowden uses the terms enabling constraints, and I find that it's a bit of a problematic term because people don't necessarily associate the idea of a constraint with something that's enabling. But it's this idea that we need containment. Because a system that is uncontained is not safe. We've heard a lot about psychological safety. So what I have a practice of disrupting myself. I find, you know, if I want to be congruent in taking other people into these uncertain processes, I need to be comfortable there myself. And the way that I do it is I very often attend working conferences in the Tavistock tradition. I don't know how many of you know, have a clue what that means, but it's basically group psychodynamics. And what you learn there is that if you take people into uncertainty, there needs to be containment. So they do things like, for example, their role boundaries between the people who facilitate and the rest of the group, time boundaries, space boundaries. You know, and once you start applying some of this thinking to what goes on in organizations, then suddenly you can see why there is so little psychological safety, because there's no containment. Then we need enabling conditions or scaffolds, and you'll see that that is within the container now. So these are things, and I'll get into more detail in the next slide, but these are things like Slack. We heard yesterday about Slack. If we want a system to be able to morph and to learn, but it is so busy that it's always on the edge of burnout, how will that happen? So we need some slack in our organizations. Networks. There's I don't know if for those of you interested in reading, especially in the complexity space, there's a lady called Professor Mary Ulbeen, who's doing wonderful research on what she's calling enabling adaptive space. Her co-author in the research just recently published a book called Adaptive Space. And it's all around how do you build networks in your organization so that ideas can flow more easily and innovation can actually happen. So all of these things happen within this almost like a cone of possibility where I've got directionality, I know I've got orientation, I know more or less where I am, and there's containment. And if I've got all of that, then I can allow for local autonomy. So the cone provides coherence. So it keeps us from all going in different directions. We remain recognizable as one company. We're all heading in the same direction within the same, sometimes I call them safety guardrails. So we don't have some groups or some people just going off and doing something that's not aligned to our strategy or that's not coherent, but I can allow for local autonomy. So if you think of values, for example, I can institute a value almost as one of these governing constraints down here. I can say, we are a company with integrity, and integrity looks like these 5 behaviors, and you will do these things, and I'm going to measure you. So I'm telling you what integrity looks like, as if you don't know. You know, it's a. How many of you have been through those? What I can also do is I can put the value. I can put the value down as a boundary. So I can say, we have a value of integrity, and therefore, this is who we are not. There's a boundary here. If you cross that boundary, there's going to be consequences, but I'm not going to tell you how to have integrity. I'm just telling you where the boundary is. Typically, this is how we raise our children, isn't it? So it's a very different way of thinking about it, but the idea is what I'm trying to create is a container for flow and for fluidity, where it's safe to experiment, where it's safe to question our policies and our structures and our processes, and where we can move forwards and change what we're doing and our structure as we go along. So I know this is still quite conceptual. I want to apply it to, for example, what it might look like in enabling scaled agility. The last key aspect to this is feedback. We can't be responsive. I mean, the reason why we want to enable better flow, the reason why we want to be agile, is because we want to respond, we want to be responsive to an ever-changing environment. If we don't have feedback, how can we be responsive? And this feedback is what I'm calling, it's fractal feedback. So I'm aware of myself, I'm aware of the people around me, I'm aware of the industry, I'm aware of what's happening globally. It's like a multi-leveled awareness and feedback, and it's diverse feedback. You know, and very often I think the challenge to organizations, are you getting any of these feedback, of this feedback? You know, we've got, in the Agile community, we've got many cadences, but do we have effective feedback from our customers? If we are responding to customer need, do we have effective feedback from our customers? And sometimes what happens is it becomes a bit of a checkbox exercise. We've got the Net Promoter Score. How many of you use the Net Promoter Score? We get the information, but we don't act on it. You know, it's there, but we don't act on it. And sometimes we get our feedback from people who think just like us. We don't like getting feedback from people who think differently. So how diverse is the feedback? That's another question. So I want to apply this now to what this might look like in enabling agility or scaled agility. So what we need to do first is map the current disposition of the system. So this is complexity jargon, unfortunately. But the idea here is that any system is predisposed in a certain way. It describes the culture, what is possible in a system and what isn't possible in a system. Systems don't really have specific causal relationships. If people ask you what are the levers for change, what are the drivers for change, they're kind of assuming that there's some magic lever I can pull, and then all of a sudden, everyone will be agile. These don't exist. You know, a system, it's disposed in a certain way, and we need to understand it. And then there's these wonderful things called adjacent possibles. It's things that's already in the system, that's moving in the right direction, that would actually not be too hard to move to. Have you guys heard of something called positive deviance? It's this idea that in any system, there will always be, for example, agile pockets that exist even before they heard the word agile. You know, there's certain things that's already in the system that we can move towards. And we need to meet the system where it is and start where we are. I think very often we try and make the system the way that we want it to be. We need to start with the system as it is. Meet it where it is, and don't try and force it into a state that it's not ready for. Then up there we've got this idea of directionality is a sense of purpose. Sometimes people talk about intent. For those of you who read Team of Teams, or you're familiar with any of what the US military are doing, there's this idea of commander's intent. This is not the same as a goal or a very specific target. It is just something that sets direction. It could be a narrative, but it's this idea, it could be a vision, but it is something that provides direction. And very often I think agile transformations fail because we don't have that. How many of the agile teams on the ground know what they are doing? What is the purpose of it? How does it link into the broader purpose of the organization? I don't think that we are very good at communicating intent and setting direction. I don't know. What do you guys think? You're more closer? No, okay. Thank you. So this, I think, is often where we need to start. Down here, we've got legislation, we've got budgets, we've sometimes got technology constraints. We've all got legacy systems that we kind of need to deal with sometimes. And then up there, we've got the agile values, for example. I think we don't pay enough attention to the values. We just jump directly into the practices, and we just start doing Scrum and doing Kanban and all of these things, and we forget about the values. So the agile values, there are rhythms and cadences. So if a jazz band, the rhythm helps them to make music and not make noise. It is something that keeps them together. Principles, shared language, and even rituals. And I think it's interesting, again, in the agile community, we've got a shared language amongst ourselves. That language becomes a barrier the moment you move out of the agile community. So I speak a lot, to executives, to, for example, people in the HR and OD community. And the jargon that keeps us together as a community, we understand each other. They have got no idea what you're talking about when you say, we're doing a daily stand-up, and it's the Scrum, and the Scrum Master and the product, they've got no idea. So language can be a containment device, but it can also exclude others. And I think that's something that we need to think about. And then something like limiting work in progress could also be one of these containment, one of these enabling constraints. Then inside, Slack, we've already spoken about. Diversity. So if you think of how Agile is supposed to work, we need to work in cross-functional teams. One of the reasons why we do that is to introduce diversity. I think complexity can completely change the diversity conversation, for example, in South Africa and elsewhere, because we've framed diversity as a problem. It's a problem that we need to solve, and the way that we do it is through quotas or through, process, all of these compliance processes. From a complex perspective, if I've got no diversity, I've got no resilience. So just think about, for example, the difference between a sheep farm and a national park or a jungle. If there's a drought, what happens to the sheep if there's a really bad drought? They kind of all die together, hey? Because they're all the same. They eat the same food, there's homogeneity, they've got no resilience. We know that the jungle or the national park will survive because there's diversity. Might survive changed, but there's diversity. So I believe diversity is a strategic asset to nurture, not a problem to solve. And I think it can completely change the conversation about that, specifically in South Africa. Networks, I don't think we look after our networks well enough. Frameworks would fit in there, and I'm going to talk you guys through how I see frameworks now and this idea of meta skills. So do we know how to co-create with others in the moment like a jazz band does? Do we know how to think critically? Do we know how to do sense making? Do all of these things, if we can build those in as skills in the organization, it'll enable adaptability and adaptive cultures and fluidity in the organization, not just flow. And then in terms of feedback, we need self-awareness. We need to be situationally aware what's going on around us. We need to be aware of client needs And we need to be aware of industry trends, locally and globally. Otherwise, what are we responding to? And so the last concept, and I've thrown a lot at you guys, but I think I'm going to end early so that we can answer some questions. This idea of scaffolding. It's something I came across not too long ago. I met a lady called Anne Pendleton Julian, and she's fascinating. She's an architect who understands complexity. So she talks a lot about designing for emergence. And this is something that I almost want to put out as a challenge and I'm doing this for myself as well. So many of us are either internal or external coaches or consultants in an organization, trying to influence the organization towards greater agility. Now, if you use the scaffolds now as a metaphor, so there's a scaffold that most of us are familiar with, that's the top one. So these are the scaffolding that goes up, either before a building is built, or to renovate an existing building. So that's what that picture there, they're painting the outside. Quite a rigid structure, and it enables either another rigid structure to be built, or just to make superficial changes to a structure. And once it's done, the scaffolding is removed, and it disappears, and the rigid structure is left there. And I think very often, as consultants, we end up being like that kind of a scaffold. If we are scaffolds at all, because I think sometimes we act as if we're the actual structure, and we never leave. You know, I used to work for 2 of the big 5 consultancies, and I understand how that industry works. So can we see ourselves as scaffolds, temporary structures to help something else be built or emerge, or do we, try and entrench ourselves? The second one, that's the middle one, it's really interesting. These are nutrient scaffolds that they use for skin grafts. So it's a scaffold that they put, if you've got really badly burnt or something happened to your skin, there's nutrients inside that scaffold. It's like a film that they put over your wound, and the nutrients activate the DNA in your skin cells to replicate and to create new skin cells. So that to me is an interesting metaphor as well. Can we be like that scaffold that because the interesting thing is the scaffold's nutrients gets used up as it's doing its work. So it disappears as the skin grows. So that's interesting. But then the third one I feel is the most interesting. So that is an image of a cardiac patch. So how this works, this is a nano scaffold. So when you've had a heart attack and you've got these issues with your heart muscles, this is a patch that they apply that enables they seed it with cardiac cells, so new muscle grows. But as it grows, the scaffold transforms as well. So in the end, it becomes a conductor, and it becomes like a built-in pacemaker in your heart. So the scaffold and the heart both change in this process. And I find these really interesting in terms of how are we as consultants and coaches and scrum masters and all of these, how are we engaging with our organizations? Do we see ourselves as the structure, or can we see ourselves as scaffolds? And then can we allow ourselves to be transformed in the process? Because that to me is this idea of fluidity. So either we work ourselves out of a job, so we are the nutrient scaffold that basically enables the adaptive DNA in the organization to activate and start doing its work, or we are both changed in the process and we become like a more fluid organism, if you want to call it that. So I want to give you one example that I've come across of what I believe to be quite a good scaffolding process. Because very often I think when we go into organizations with agile practices, we lead with specific frameworks. And I think if we can entrench the principles first before people are introduced to frameworks, we very often don't even need to introduce them to any frameworks, because once they understand the principles, they can go and basically enable or emerge their own fit for context agility. That for me is a really key phrase. Because I don't think, I do a lot of work, for example, with HR teams and other teams in organizations, even exco teams. So Scrum, for example, is a process, it's a framework that fits in certain contexts. doesn't fit in others. I haven't seen many executive teams, for example, where Scrum is a good fit. But they can emerge their own way of being agile if they understand the processes and the principles. So we came across this quite recently. There's a process called Okalua Flow Lab. How many of you have heard of those? So it's basically, it's a business simulation that is agnostic of any frameworks. It's like, it's a simulation that basically allows the people playing it to experience the principles of agility without any preconceived ideas of what kind of framework will follow after this. And how their definition of agility is it's kind of the intersection of flow, learning, and collaboration. And you experience all three of those things in the simulation. And what we've seen, where we've implemented it, is that people go and then they emerge their own ways of being agile. Once they've understood, for example, why do you need to limit work in progress? Once they've seen it, they can go and they can implement it in a way that suits them or that fits their context. And I think this is a scaffold that is, if you can scaffold people's understanding of agility through the principles and not through specific frameworks, I think there's a much better chance that agility will stick and that it will be resilient and sustainable in the organization than if we lead with specific practices. So this is my last slide. And I'm wondering what a complexity-based manifesto might look like. And this is what I came up with. So we enabled organizations to shift from agile to agility, from flow to fluidity, alignment to coherence, standards and recipes to fit for context, and designing rigid structures to designing scaffolds for emergence. So yes, that's basically it from me. I did warn you that I'm glad that I was up first because I knew that I'm going to throw quite a few concepts at you guys. I hope that I stimulated some questions. I don't know if I've got the answers necessarily. But I wanted to give you some different metaphors and different constructs to think about agility. I'm a little bit early, hey? Did that work? Yes. Questions, comments, arguments?
Well, thanks for bending our minds. So early in the morning, I'm sure there is some questions or everybody understands kind of.
I hope that I can articulate this correctly. I agree in principle with that. It makes a lot of sense. My question is, organizations sometimes need some kind of kickstart or some view of what other possibilities are like. So how possible is it to move to more of a context fit for purpose way of moving or to change versus if we don't know what those possibilities are? Almost like some kind of kickstart just to see. Does that question make sense?
Yes. I think, Dylan, it's very much about how things are positioned up front. Because I think sometimes what happens is we position things as, let's take a typical framework, like Scrum or Kanban. It's not positioned as this is a seed or this is a starting place. It's like the jazz band. This is the song we're going to start with, but we all know it's going to evolve from here. We're not going to, it can become fit for context. I think sometimes it's introduced into organizations as this is the structure, and you will follow it like this.
Often that's what they want, though. We're operating like this, and that's what I'm trying to kind of get to. So, Scrum, this is the new way now. And it's often, you're right, it's not planted as that this should just be the next step, the seed, to continue.
Yeah, and I think that's part of our role as consultants, to challenge that. And to make sure that when we are the ones selling it, that we don't sell it like that. I think that is... So to sell it like a scaffold from the beginning, as something that will evolve, not as something that needs to be pristine and done in a... It's not a recipe, basically. That's the...
Cool. Any more questions, comments?
At the back there.
Yeah, so this did challenge the mind a bit. Just a question, I suppose it's more philosophical than practical, is, you started on talking about freedom and flow emerging from that. With some of the concepts that are going on, don't you risk inhibiting the flow by creating some kind of structure, which means you then contain it a little bit, then allowing freedom?
So I think emergence can't happen if there's no containment. So if you think about it, if there's nothing containing the flow of water, it can't really flow, it dissipates. So I think it's around introducing the right kind of structure. So if we introduce very rigid top-down command and control kind of structures, it's almost like building a canal for a river. There's no room for it to evolve. If we can put in the right kind of structure, so I'll refer back to the jazz band, for example. They have a rhythm, they've got a key that they've agreed to, and they've got a song where they start. And they all understand the meta skills of how to improvise. So that gives just enough structure for them to be in this uncertain emergent space. If there's no structure at all, then they would make noise. So I think it's about the right kind of structure. It's not about having no structure, because then, basically we're in chaos. Does it make sense?
Yeah, it does. Maybe linking a bit to that is, what's in the flow kind of environment, what would the value of dams be? Where you have very specific containment to catch water to then disseminate, versus much more free-flowing, but right kind of structure to navigate.
Yes. And I think, this is where Cynefin is really useful, because, the more rigid governing constraints, things like dams and, those would probably be more useful, I don't know, in the ordered domains, although they may play a role in complexity. But I think anything that is kind of commanding from the top down and that creates rigidity becomes problematic the moment that you're in complexity, because there you need to be able to be adaptive and respond, you need fluidity. But it's not to say that dams are bad. I think that is a key message here, is that everything has utility within boundaries. You just need to understand what the boundaries are. So dams aren't bad. It's just you need to deploy them where they're useful.
We have one more here.
Yes.
I just want to know if you could elaborate a little bit more on the difference between intent and goals or milestones. Like, where is the boundary between those two?
So I think a goal is much more specific than intent. So intent, the best example I can think of comes from the military world, where there's commander's intent, which is kind of the intent that they set at the beginning of a battle or at the beginning of a war, versus a goal that is much more of a short-term, much more specific. It is something that you need to attain, and there's no room to maneuver, whereas an intent is much more vague, although it's not so vague that it doesn't give direction. I'm not sure if I'm articulating this properly, and again, I think, if you go back to that framework, goals are fine if they're short-term. So if I start moving in the direction of that intent, I can have shorter-term goals, as long as I don't get fixated on them. If I've given a few steps and I realize that actually this goal I thought was the best way to go, something has changed now and it's not. And then I am able to pivot. But sometimes what happens if we've got strategies and goals, we become we become married to them. And then even if things shift and they no longer apply, we don't want to let go of them. So I think it's broader, but it's not so broad that it doesn't give direction, which is still a bit ambiguous, so I hope it answers your question.
Wow. I think, okay, very last one. And then the conversation needs to continue outside, yeah.
There's a governing constraint for you.
Okay. Measure. So in all of this, what is your guidance on how to measure fluidity, how well it's going, how badly it's going? As teams that we are in and build, just something to work with, that we can sort of go, oh, yeah, we're on track, off track.
To measure fluidity specifically. Well, my first response to that is, why do we want to measure everything, is my first response, but that might be a cop-out, because I need to think. But I think, so an interesting thing to think about is Dave Snowden talks about vector measures. So it's measuring, are we moving in the right direction at the speed that we think is appropriate? And I think it's interesting because something like measuring fluidity is quite an intangible thing. So we can measure flow quite tangibly. We can see what our flow rate is. Fluidity, because I think part of that is a mindset. It's how we're thinking. So you could look at, for example, things like gathering narrative or stories from the organization over time and seeing if those stories and the way that people make meaning of their own stories is shifting over time towards becoming more fluid. Which may have different definitions in different organizations. I don't know that there will be a very fixed way to measure fluidity, but I haven't thought about it, so it's...
Thank you, it makes sense.
Cool.
Wow. Please help me to just applaud Sonja on a great keynote.